So next up is Katasha Cornwell with FDOT. She's with the Office of Environmental Management. She graduated from the University of Florida with a degree in zoology. She's an environmental professional with the Florida Department of Environmental Transportation, working at the agency for 25 years in various capacities. Currently, she is the interim director for the Office of Environmental Management, responsible for the National Environmental Policy Act compliance and developing procedures and innovative approaches related to protected species and habitat for the transportation program. Katasha, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Jason, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Jason, for the introduction. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about the Florida DOT's conservation plan for the Florida Panther. And it's a partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as our state, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, but kind of focusing on how we're working towards recovery of the Florida Panther, but also how that work supports the Florida Wildlife Corridor, as well as other species, as you kind of saw in Brent's video, and back to Jason's point about those common species. Anything that we do for the Florida Panther to support connectivity also supports, a whole range of other species as well. So just to give a little bit of context about Florida, Jason covered a lot, but just to touch on it from a transportation perspective, we have over 12,000 centerline miles of roads on our state highway system and over 6,600 bridges that we have on the DOT's specific responsibility. And so I think stats might vary a little bit about the number of residents that we have, whether it's the 21.5 we see here on this slide or the 23.3 million in the article that's highlighted here. But, a lot of residents, quite a few visitors annually. So, we're approaching 80 million visitors, which means we really have a pretty large transportation demand. We're going to continue having to support the mission of Florida DOT by continuing to meet the needs of the folks that are using our transportation system. So, but at the same time, right, we know we have this endangered Florida Panther. That population is relatively small, with about 120 to 230 adults and subadults, which is the official estimate that the agencies have. And at the same time, unfortunately, with this one breeding population that we have in South Florida, wildlife vehicle collisions are one of the leading causes of panther mortality. And so you can see kind of from this graph here on the slide that we've been working really hard. We had a couple of years in 2015, 2016 that were pretty challenging. But since then, we've really been working hard to bring that trend back down. But we still have a lot of work to do. And so, how are we working towards that goal? Well, Brent mentioned a lot about Alligator Alley. We've been working on Florida Panther wildlife crossings for quite some time, since the late 80s, early 90s timeframe. Brent's obviously still working on that area. We have roughly 58, there's probably a little bit more now, wildlife crossings supporting the Florida Panther within the Florida Panther focus area that's defined by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And from a connectivity standpoint, we have throughout the state, we have over 200 wildlife crossings, kind of depending on the way you define a wildlife crossing. These are ones that really were intended, built as connections, where we might have, again, those 6,600 bridges throughout the state. There may be other areas that weren't built necessarily for wildlife crossings, but we know wildlife are utilizing them. So from a connectivity standpoint, we're doing fairly well, but we do need to do more to help support the Florida Panther population. So why this conservation plan then? Well, as we go through endangered species consultation on a project by project basis using section 7A2 of that consultation requirement, we started realizing that consultation was becoming a little bit more challenging. It's kind of working through the process with the Fish and Wildlife Service could be difficult. It could open us up, as well as the service, the Army Corps, if they're issuing us a permit, it can open it up to litigation exposure. It's, those things add more project cost and just overall make the whole process much more complex. So as we started encountering some of these challenges, we started trying to figure out what can we do differently. And knowing how Brent and his team were kind of already working through a lot of these voluntary measures that they're doing that are outside of project requirements, we started trying to figure out how we could develop a paradigm shift. How can we partner with the Fish and Wildlife Service, with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission in a way that was much more robust and looked at things from like more of a program level perspective? So we used sort of model that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers worked on with the Fish and Wildlife Service to, again, do some of these voluntary measures on canal projects that they have in the Mississippi area that really are intended to support species recovery, not really looking at project by project sort of mitigation strategies, we'll call them, to address those very specific project impacts. So moving forward, that's what we decided to do, is develop this conservation plan. And we use our NEPA assignment program. So for folks in the room that maybe aren't familiar with that, the certain DOTs are allowed to get assigned federal highway responsibilities to approve NEPA documents for transportation projects. And this is a very, robust program. It has to go through, a whole MOU process and everything. We gave up sovereign immunity to get sued in federal court so that all of our NEPA decisions are our own. So this is a big deal. But that NEPA assignment gives us sort of that federal hat and that federal responsibility to help recover endangered species. And so some of you, again, might know, but all federal agencies are kind of charged with that to help recover endangered species. So we can use that NEPA assignment to meet those Section 7A1 responsibilities. And then by doing that, it kind of creates this framework where the Fish and Wildlife Service can better acknowledge all those voluntary measures and proactive things that we're doing from a conservation measure perspective on the landscape and through a program level approach, versus kind of getting down to those nitty gritty, well, you need to have another couple acres here, another little, thing there on your project. It's a much wider view of what we're doing, and it helps align the missions of DOT, which is moving people and goods safely and efficiently from place to place, with the Fish and Wildlife Service mission of kind of moving panthers across the landscape more safely, as well as hopefully eventually getting to the point where they have multiple breeding populations throughout the state to bring them to that recovery aspect. So kind of looking at this at a big picture, the conservation plan doesn't mean we have no impacts to the Florida panther whatsoever. It means that we're still going to have some impacts on a project by project basis, but on the whole, we're going to have a net conservation benefit through these voluntary conservation measures, plus the conservation measures or mitigation strategies that we're also applying on our projects. So how do we do this? There's really three main goals within the recovery plan for the panther. And the first goal is to reduce habitat threats. And from a transportation perspective, reducing the habitat threat is really about, going to remain the putting wildlife crossings and building that connectivity on the landscape. And kind of whether that's through traditional wildlife crossings, these wildlife crossing shelves, those cool canal crossings that you saw Brent doing, or maybe adding fencing in certain locations to help reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. All of those different techniques are going to help to continue to reduce that threat. But again, some of these are going to be things we can do voluntary ahead of time, or kind of like retrofit areas, versus just waiting for that road project to come through and go, oh, yep, now we have to address connectivity. The second goal is really about range expansion. So again, one breeding population in South Florida, kind of need to try to get to 3 breeding populations over, some duration to be able to have this panther population recover. So I don't really have a good shot of it here in my slide, but if you happen to notice in Jason's slides earlier, he had, the whole state of Florida. You could see Lake Okeechobee. And so there's kind of 2 main areas on the landscape that are kind of obstacles for the panther. The first is in Lake Okeechobee, there's a river that flows out of that called the Caloosahatchee River. And we really need to start seeing the female panthers moving north of the Caloosahatchee River to be able to start having that second breeding population. And there's been some really positive trends in the last several years, but we're still rooting for those female panthers to keep moving and breeding north of the river. And then once they get north of that river, we also have this I-4 corridor, which you can kind of see here in red on this slide, which is another sort of obstacle for them to make it past in order, again, to have this really successful breeding populations and meat recovery. So I think you've heard both Brent and Jason talk a little bit about the vision and having people really be thinking ahead. And so as we, the DOT, went through our NEPA process for I-4 quite some time ago, similar to Alligator Alley, some folks were like, hey, we need to be thinking about connectivity here. And so certain wildlife crossings were required to be built on I-4. And Jason mentioned one that was just completed construction, really important wildlife crossing. Brent has a cool video he can share with you later if you have time to talk to him about that. But in addition to that, we also have our very first wildlife crossing overpass dedicated to wildlife specifically going across I-4. And so again, this is something that Brent and his team have worked on very hard. It's under construction now. And from a Florida perspective, right, overpasses for wildlife are not very common, not common at all. We only have 2 throughout the state that are really built for recreation, and wildlife happen to utilize them. So this is a cool experiment to see how things work just for wildlife. But again, just supporting that range expansion, getting the Panthers across I-4 is really important. So now we've talked a lot about all these, these 2 main goals of building crossings. How do we prioritize and fund that? That's all built right into the Panther Conservation Plan, where we work very closely with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, again, our state partners, our NGO partners like Jason and other entities around the state that help us, identify the needs and prioritize where we need to go next. And so not only prioritization is important, but also funding, right? That's a key thing for everyone, I think, when it comes to these crossings. We have had some success with the grant program through FHWA, but we're really exploring some more innovative approaches, which this plan lets us do. It helps us kind of, it's kind of a catalyst to get us to this place where we can talk to developers and foundations and figure out some innovative approaches to doing funding for these really important crossings that provide this connection. So now I'm thinking about that 3rd goal of the recovery plan, which is really public outreach and education. And so I'm stealing Beth Pratt's slap a kitten on it phrase here, which I think is great. But just again, thinking about, we do really good on the transportation side at looking at, motorcycle safety, wear your seatbelt, don't drink and drive. And, we're good at those sort of campaigns, but we haven't really done one that focuses on wildlife vehicle collisions, trying to get people to slow down at night, trying to be aware when they're driving through some of these areas that are sensitive. So we think we can really partner together with our safety office. And again, thinking about the mission of the DOT, we're trying to get to what we call target 0. And that's really reducing fatalities and serious injuries to 0 on our state highway system. And even though it sounds a little bit surprising, maybe, something as small as an armadillo can cause a motorcycle fatality. People swerve, things like that can happen. So really all wildlife vehicle collisions, can be a concern. So the more those we can reduce, the more we're helping to meet that target 0 goal. And so our safety office, just on their own, put together these cool do not disturb door hangers that have a safety message on the back. And we're even building more partnerships with them to start having some wildlife vehicle collision reduction safety measures and other programs in place with them. So we're really excited about that. Other things that help to support our public outreach and education, we're starting to go to different events in the communities. So our folks in the District 4, which I know doesn't mean much to y'all, but kind of on our East Coast, went to this Palm Beach Zoo Panther Day event. Folks like Brent and some of our other team members went to the Naples Zoo Panther Day event. And people out in the public really don't know that DOT has biologists, environmental scientists, et cetera, on staff working really hard, and along with the engineers, right? We need them to help us figure out how to build these crossings, but they don't know that we have these folks on our team and that they're actually working really hard every day to make these connections and to help not only support the corridor, reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, but also to get folks home safely by keeping those wildlife hopefully off the roadway. Another thing that we're working on, and Jason touched on this a lot, they have amazing storytellers and production crews and everything at the foundation, but DOT does have some support on this side as well. And storytelling is something that we're working on. And this particular story is about Brooktail, a female panther who teaches her young kittens to use wildlife crossings. And so because she has a crooked tail, she's easy to recognize on those game cameras. Brent mentioned the FDOT Foundation. They've done a lot of video and camera trap data for him. And we have some other entities that have captured her on their cameras. And so we kind of were able to stitch together a really cool story showing how she's teaching her kittens to use these crossings and how important they are. other things like doing NPR interviews and podcasts. Brent's had some really good opportunities to do that and really showcase and do some storytelling about all the good work that he and his team do. And then just working with entities, again, like the Fish and Wildlife Service, to highlight our partnerships. And so this was a really fun post that they did that showed, again, that female broke-tail and her kittens. And it had tons of likes. I think it was their most liked post that they had done on this platform. So with that, it's really important that we continue working on these partnerships that Jason was mentioning earlier, kind of widening that tent out and, you know, on the DOT side as well, and working hard together to bring that connection for the whole state of Florida, but also for the Florida Panther, so we can work to recover that. So with that, I'll look forward to taking any questions that you guys have after the next presentation.